Celeste Mercer stood at the center of a billion-dollar construction site and laughed at the single father crouched over a sheet of plywood. In front of her lay the most expensive blueprints in Chicago, stamped by every licensed engineer the city had to offer. In front of him sat a stubby pencil, a faded safety vest, and hands that had never once touched a boardroom presentation. "You think a few pencil marks from a construction worker are going to save my billion-dollar project?" she asked. Holden Barrett did not look up. He pointed to the crack running through the concrete slab beneath her feet and said, "No, but they might keep it from sinking. Stay until the end to find out why that one builder's sketch became the only thing standing between this project and total collapse." The city of Chicago had seen ambitious real estate projects before, but Mercer Sky Harbor was something that came along once in a generation, a riverfront complex that promised to reshape the northern corridor with a luxury hotel, high-end residential towers, a retail center, and a public plaza designed to draw the kind of foot traffic that turned neighborhoods into destinations. The project belonged to Mercer Development Group, and at the helm was Celeste Mercer, 36 years old, the youngest CEO in the company's history, and the one person standing between a legacy her grandfather built and a board of directors that had been looking for reasons to question her judgment since the day she took the chair. The numbers had not been kind to her over the past 3 quarters, a combination of rising material costs, delayed permits, and a commercial market that refused to cooperate with anyone's projections, and the patience of the men around the table was wearing thin in ways she could feel without a single word being spoken. Her uncle, Vaughn Mercer, a founding partner who had never accepted that the company passed to Celeste rather than to him, had spent the last year building quiet alliances within the board, offering whispered reassurances that he was available whenever they decided enough was enough. Garrett Holloway, the firm's lead strategy and legal advisor, had been in the room for every major decision Celeste made, and had never once advocated for her when the room pushed back, a detail she had noticed but not yet understood the full meaning of. Sky Harbor was not just a project, it was the line in the sand, the one deliverable that would either silence the critics or hand them everything they needed to end her tenure. On the construction side, the site stretched across 11 acres of reclaimed riverfront land on Chicago's near north, a landscape that had once been industrial, then neglected, and was now being reshaped into something the city had not seen in decades. Holden Barrett had been brought onto the project as a contract builder, one of 24 subcontractors hired to handle specific phases of construction, in his case the secondary framing and the restoration of a historic warehouse structure that sat on the western edge of the site. He was 39 years old, built like someone who had spent 20 years working with his hands rather than thinking about them, and he arrived every morning before the general foreman and left after most of the crew had gone home. He had a daughter named Piper, 8 years old, who spent long days at a neighbor's house while her father worked, and who had inherited his habit of drawing buildings on whatever surface was available. Holden was not there to design anything, not officially, and no one on Garrett's management team had ever asked his opinion about anything above his pay grade, which suited both sides perfectly until the week he started looking at the eastern foundation zone and realized that something was deeply, structurally wrong. What Holden saw was not dramatic at first, a softness in the ground that the official soil surveys had smoothed over, a pattern of moisture that did not match the drainage reports, and a faint subsidence along the temporary concrete work that engineers had attributed to standard post-pour settling. He had spent enough years working on old structures foundations laid over buried waterways, timber pilings sunk into fill soil, buildings that had been fighting the ground beneath them for 100 years, to recognize the difference between a building settling and a building losing. He pulled the official foundation drawings and looked at where the eastern load-bearing system was planned, a deep concrete grid designed to transfer weight from the tower above to bearing soil below, and he matched those coordinates to what he knew about the neighborhood's geological history. The eastern edge of this property sat directly over the trace of an old buried canal, a waterway that had been filled decades ago and whose path was not recorded in the current geological surveys because the municipal maps had never been updated. No one had asked the ground what it remembered, and the ground was beginning to answer on its own. Holden did the only thing he knew how to do. He picked up a pencil and began to draw what he saw. He worked on a large sheet of plywood propped against a temporary barrier, sketching a revised load path that would route the structural weight away from the unstable buried canal zone, incorporating a floating foundation approach that accepted the presence of groundwater rather than trying to eliminate it, and sketching what that shift could mean for the public plaza planned above it. A water feature, a hanging garden, a canal echo, rather than a canal buried under denial. He was deep in the sketch when he heard expensive boots on gravel behind him, turned, and found the CEO of Mercer Development Group standing 10 feet away with an expression he had seen before. The expression of someone who had already made up their mind. Celeste did not know who Holden Barrett was when she saw him crouched over that plywood board, but she did not need to know his name to form an opinion. She saw a construction worker in a worn vest altering what appeared to be a project document without authorization, and she saw the dozen engineers and managers on her site watching to see how she would respond, and she made a decision she would spend months regretting in less than 30 seconds. Garrett was at her shoulder, immediately offering the context she had not asked for, explaining that the man was a subcontractor working the warehouse restoration, that he held no structural engineering credentials, and that he had apparently been sketching alternative foundation concepts on his own initiative. The word initiative carried a tone in Garrett's voice that made it sound like a violation, and Celeste, who was already under pressure and already in the mood to demonstrate authority, took the cue without examining where it came from. She stepped forward, studied the plywood sketch for a moment, and asked in a voice that carried across the site who had given him permission to modify project documentation. Holden stood, and he did not apologize, which she registered immediately, because in her experience people who had done something wrong apologized before they explained. He told her calmly that he had not modified any official document, that he had drawn a separate analysis on a scrap sheet because he believed the Eastern Foundation plan contained a critical error related to an unmapped buried canal running beneath the site. He pointed to the specific area on his sketch, walked her through the load path problem in plain language, and told her that if construction continued on the current foundation design, the groundwater would find its own path, and it would find it through the basement of $1 billion building. Celeste listened, and she understood more of it than she let on, but she was surrounded by her most senior engineers, she was behind schedule, and she had a board meeting in 4 days where any sign of uncertainty would be used against her like a weapon. So she said what she said. "You think a few pencil marks from a construction worker are going to save my $1 billion project?" A few people smiled. Garrett called Holden's concept a backyard sketch. Celeste told him to return to his assigned work and reminded everyone on site that no design modifications of any kind were to be discussed without written authorization from the project engineering team. It was a clean, decisive moment of management, and she felt the authority of it for about 3 seconds before she saw Holden's face, which was not angry or humiliated or resentful, but simply tired. The way a person looks when they have said something true and been told it was not convenient. Before he rolled up the plywood sheet, he paused, looked at the hairline crack running through the temporary slab at Celeste's feet, and said quietly that he was not trying to be right. He just did not want to be standing at the bottom of something that should not have been built. Then he walked away, and as he passed Betrayal Dawson, the project's young geotechnical engineer, he handed her the folded sketch without a word. Betrayal took the sketch, opened it later in the equipment trailer, and felt the back of her neck go cold, because the buried canal Holden had drawn on that plywood board was in the same location she had flagged in a preliminary site assessment 8 months earlier, an assessment that had been returned to her, marked not requiring action in Garrett Holloway's handwriting. That night, the sky over Chicago opened up and dropped 2 inches of rain in 4 hours, and by morning the eastern foundation pit had water in it that had not come from above. The water in the pit was the first thing the site foreman called in, and Celeste arrived before 7 in the morning to find her lead engineers standing at the edge of the eastern excavation, looking at each other in the way experts look at each other when the problem is larger than their prepared answers. The groundwater had not simply pooled from the rain. It was rising from below, tracing a path along the base of the temporary shoring wall, with a consistency that suggested it was following something, a channel, a path, a memory carved into the soil over 150 years that no municipal survey had remembered to record. Garrett was already there and already managing the situation, telling the crew that post-rain infiltration was a standard site condition, that additional dewatering pumps would handle the volume, and that the structural team would review the shoring specifications before the week was out. His voice was smooth and reasonable, and it would have been entirely convincing if Betrayal Dawson had not been standing in the corner of the equipment trailer with Holden's sketch folded in her jacket pocket. Celeste walked the eastern perimeter herself, the way she used to do before she had enough authority to delegate the walking. She noticed the crack in the temporary slab that Holden had pointed to was now 3 times as wide as it had been the morning before, and 2 additional cracks had appeared parallel to it, spaced in a pattern that was not random, that was following the line of something running below. She remembered Holden's words more clearly than she wanted to. She did not say anything yet, because saying anything meant deciding something, and deciding something meant she could no longer claim she had not known. Instead, she called her chief structural engineer and asked him to bring the original soil boring data, not the summary report, but the raw data, all of it. Sterling Quinn called at 11 in the morning, and the conversation was short and unpleasant. Quinn was the primary outside investor in Sky Harbor, a developer who had backed Mercer on the strength of Celeste's track record and a commitment that had brought him in at a number that gave him substantial leverage. He had heard from a contact on the project management side that there had been a foundation event, his word for it, and he wanted to understand what it meant for the schedule and the permit timeline. Celeste told him the team was assessing and that she would have a complete picture by end of week, which was the most honest thing she could say without knowing yet what the complete picture contained. Quinn told her that if the city moved to flag the permit status, He would have no choice but to revisit his position, and the way he said revisit carried a weight that Celeste felt in her sternum. Von Mercer's name did not come up in the conversation, but she felt his presence in the call the way she sometimes felt a draft from an unsealed door. Not visible, but undeniably there. Brielle found Holden at the warehouse restoration site, where he was carefully dismantling a section of original brick veneer to evaluate the underlying timber frame. She showed him the sketch and told him what she had found in her own assessment 8 months earlier. Holden set down his tools, looked at the data, and said without pride or drama that the dewatering pumps were going to make things worse if they kept running at the current rate, because displacing the water without addressing the path would simply shift the pressure toward the southern retaining wall. Brielle asked him where he had learned to read site conditions the way he did. Holden thought for a moment and said he learned from buildings that could not afford to be wrong. She asked if he would be willing to develop the full alternative design. He said he would, but only if the request came from Celeste Mercer directly, because he was not going to put his name on anything that could be used later to transfer blame. That afternoon, a section of temporary retaining wall on the southern edge of the foundation pit settled 3 inches in 40 minutes, and the city sent a notice of inspection. Delaney Brooks had been Celeste's personal attorney for 6 years and had never been asked to look at a construction project before. But when Celeste called and said that something about the foundation situation felt less like an engineering failure and more like a withheld piece of information, Delaney started pulling records. She started with the geotechnical assessment file, and within 2 hours she found what she was looking for, or rather what was not there. Brielle's preliminary site assessment, the one that had flagged the buried canal corridor, was not included in the project file that Garrett had compiled for the city permit application. The email chain showed Garrett had received the assessment, flagged it for review, and then it had disappeared from the official record, replaced in the permit file by a summary overview that contained no mention of historical waterway traces beneath the eastern zone. Celeste sat with that information for an afternoon. She had suspected Garrett of shading things, of framing reports to suit outcomes, of being more loyal to Vaughn's long-term agenda than to her leadership. But seeing it written in document metadata and email timestamps was different from suspecting it. The geotechnical warning had been real, had been generated by a credentialed member of her own project team, had been sent to her lead advisor, and had vanished from the record at the moment it would have required a redesign that delayed the permit timeline. She thought about what that delay would have meant, and then she thought about who benefited if the delay had been pushed forward to now, when construction was underway, and the cost of correction was catastrophic. She drove to the warehouse restoration site and found Holden measuring a window opening with the focused patience she had observed in him from the beginning, the patience of someone who had learned to take careful stock of what was in front of them rather than what they expected to see. She came without the CEO posture she had carried the first time and asked him a straight question. Could his design actually work? Not theoretically, but in the specific context of this site, given the groundwater pattern and the load requirements of a mixed-use tower. He looked at her for a moment before answering, and then he said that the design would work if she was willing to accept that the old foundation plan was wrong. Not inadequate, not insufficient, but wrong, and that accepting that publicly was the only precondition he had. He explained the core of the concept. Rather than fighting the buried canal corridor with aggressive dewatering and reinforced suppression, The new approach would redirect the eastern foundation load to stable-bearing zones to the west and north, convert the unstable corridor into a managed water feature, and build the public plaza not over the problem, but as an architectural expression of it. A canal echo plaza with a reflective pool, hanging gardens, and a glass walkway that told the story of what the ground remembered. Celeste looked at the sketch he pulled from a folded envelope in his vest pocket, and she was quiet for a long time, because it was not rough, and it was not amateur, and it was not the kind of thing she could dismiss with the vocabulary she had used on the construction site. It was precise, and it solved the problem in a way that made the problem into the building's greatest story rather than its most expensive mistake. She told him she needed 24 hours. He said he understood, and went back to measuring the window frame without ceremony. Von Mercer called an emergency board session 3 days after the retaining wall settlement, framing it not as a discussion but as a crisis management necessity, and he did so without clearing the agenda with Celeste, which was a procedural violation she noted for the record, but did not have the bandwidth to contest. The session opened with Vaughn presenting a timeline of events that positioned the foundation issue as the consequence of project management failure at the CEO level, specifically failure to properly supervise geotechnical risk assessment from the start. He did not mention Garrett's name in connection with any suppressed report, because Vaughn and Garrett had been working from the same playbook, and neither had any interest in revising the narrative before it had done its work. The message to the board was simple. Celeste had let a billion-dollar foundation get built on uncertain ground. The investors were nervous, and the city was watching, and the time had come for someone experienced to step in and make the hard decisions. Garrett added his own layer, presenting what he called a risk mitigation option, a package that involved acknowledging construction deficiency, halting the project, and entering into a controlled sale agreement with a development consortium he described as experienced in post-failure recovery situations. The consortium was not named in the presentation materials. What the board was not told, and what Delaney was already beginning to piece together through property records and corporate filings, was that the consortium had financial ties to a family investment vehicle Vaughn had established 2 years earlier. If Sky Harbor could be distressed into a discounted sale, Vaughn would own the rescue before the dust settled, and he would own it alongside Holden's design concept, which had already circulated enough in the project files to be harvested by anyone paying attention. Celeste did not sign the responsibility assignment document Garrett had prepared attributing the construction deficiency to site management and subcontractor interference, the phrase that pointed at Holden without naming him. She told the board she was not prepared to assign blame without a full independent review of the complete geotechnical record, and that she had reason to believe that record had not been presented to the board in its original form. Vaughn called her position a delay tactic. Celeste called it accuracy. The session ended without a vote, which was the first outcome in weeks that felt like ground holding firm. On her way out, she told Garrett directly that she was going to need the original geotechnical files, every version, every date stamp, by 9 the following morning, and she said it without blinking. In the days that followed, Celeste stopped moving through the situation as someone reacting and started moving through it as someone deciding. She authorized Delaney to pursue the document record in full. She told Brielle that her assessment, the original one, would be entered into the project file with its original date and its original findings intact. And she drove back to the Warehouse O's restoration site and told Holden Barrett directly and without qualification, that she was requesting his full alternative design, and that she understood what she was asking him to stake his name on. Holden said he would have a complete draft ready in 48 hours. He asked if she had access to the unrestricted borehole archive. She said she would get it. He nodded and turned back to the building, and she had the clear sense that the conversation had been the beginning of something, rather than the end. Holden came to the engineering review session with a rolled hand drawing tucked under his arm, and no slide deck, no firm name on his business card, and no prepared answer for the question he knew was coming about his credentials. Garrett opened by asking, in front of a room of engineers and project managers, whether Holden held a current architectural license, whether he carried professional indemnity insurance, and whether he had any prior experience with foundation remediation on a project of this scale. Holden answered each question without defensiveness. No current architectural license, builder's liability coverage for his contracted scope, and no prior experience with a project this large in an official design capacity. Garrett paused after each answer, letting the room absorb the information. Then Holden said he had not come to replace the project architect, and that he was not there to be credentialed but to show the room what the ground was saying. And he unrolled the drawing on the table. The drawing was not what anyone expected. It was a detailed structural diagram with load calculations annotated by hand, a water flow overlay mapped against the borehole data, and an elevation study showing how the revised foundation approach would interact with the tower program above. He had labeled it the Sky Harbor Living Foundation, and the name described the operating principle of the design, a foundation that worked with the hydrological reality of the site rather than against it. The eastern section of the basement program was replaced by a managed groundwater retention zone controlled by a passive drainage system that directed water into a below-grade cistern connected to the public plaza above. The load from the eastern tower was shifted to a cluster of helical piers anchored in stable bearing strata that Holden had located by reading the borehole logs against historical waterway data. The public plaza became a canal echo garden, a shallow reflecting pool over the cistern, elevated planting beds, a glass bridge crossing, and a design narrative that did not pretend the waterway had never been there. Brielle confirmed the geological basis of the approach while the room was still processing the drawing. She laid out the original borehole data, the historical waterway trace, and a structural model she had run overnight showing pressure distribution under both plans. Under the existing plan, continued dewatering would transfer lateral pressure to the southern retaining wall within 30 to 60 days, risking a partial shoring failure that would trigger automatic permit suspension. Under Holden's approach, the revised load path avoided the unstable zone entirely. The passive drainage system reduced subsurface pressure incrementally, and the structural risk profile improved over time rather than compounding. The room got quieter as she spoke. Celeste asked how long it would take to confirm feasibility with full site data. Holden said 72 hours if they had access to the complete borehole archive, the original utility surveys, and the unrestricted geotechnical records. He looked at Garrett when he said unrestricted. Garrett said there were no restricted records. Delaney, who had been sitting at the back of the room, placed a printed document on the table without speaking, a document that showed two versions of the Eastern Zone geotechnical summary, one with the canal corridor flagged and one without, dated 10 days apart, both bearing the same report number. Garrett said nothing. The full archive was opened before the end of the session, and the buried canal appeared on the original borehole map exactly where Holden had drawn it from memory on a sheet of plywood. The city gave Mercer Development 72 hours to submit a revised foundation management plan or face an automatic permit suspension that would halt construction indefinitely. Celeste signed the response commitment herself, without consulting Vaughn, and she put Holden's name on the engineering lead line, which she knew would generate opposition she did not have the bandwidth to manage, but could not avoid. The team that assembled in the site trailer that evening was small and direct. Holden Barrett, 3 structural engineers who had been waiting for permission to stop defending the existing SIM plan, and Celeste, who stopped being an observer sometime in the first hour and started being a participant. Holden worked the way Celeste had heard craftsmen described but never actually watched. He went back to the physical site twice during the night to check measurements and read drainage behavior after the rain, and both times he returned with specific observations that redirected the team's calculations in ways the computer models had missed. He did not position himself at the center of the work. He positioned the problem at the center and organized the people around it. The engineers responded to him not because he outranked them, but because what he said turned out to be right when they checked it. The call from Piper came at 9:30 in the evening, and Holden stepped outside the trailer to take it and came back 2 minutes later with the kind of steadiness that only comes from knowing the most important thing in your life is all right. No one said anything about it, but the room shifted slightly, the way rooms shift when people stop seeing each other as job functions. Delaney called at midnight with the information that reframed everything. She had traced the corporate filing structure of the acquisition consortium. Garrett had presented as a neutral recovery partner, and after 3 layers of holding companies, she had found a majority financial interest linking back to a family trust vehicle registered in Vaughn's wife's maiden name. The consortium was not a rescue partner. It was a vehicle designed to purchase a distressed asset at a discounted valuation and redevelop it using the design approach already circulating in Holden's drawings. Vaughn's plan was not only to remove Celeste from power, it was to remove her from the project, acquire it cheaply, and rebuild it as his own success story, using the work of the man she had dismissed over a sheet of plywood. 72 hours after the team assembled, the revised plan was complete, submitted, and on record with the city. The permit review session drew a room that none of the participants had prepared for. The engineering panel from the city, 3 council members who had received calls from constituents about the Sky Harbor site, Sterling Quinn, and 2 other investors, 4 board members including Vaughn, and a reporter from a business publication who had heard through a source that something significant was about to happen. Garrett opened for the development group with a prepared statement arguing for permit suspension, controlled project handoff, and independent construction review, framing the entire crisis as the consequence of project management overreach by an unqualified CEO who had delegated structural decisions to an unlicensed contractor. Celeste stood up before Garrett finished and asked to be recognized, and she did the thing she had been rehearsing since the night in the site trailer, when she had accepted that she had been wrong about Holden Barrett in a way that mattered. She acknowledged the foundation crisis without deflection. She told the panel exactly when the geotechnical warning had been generated, by whom, and when she had been told it did not require action. She did not position it as an accusation. She positioned it as the factual sequence of events the panel needed in order to evaluate what had actually happened. Then she invited Barrett to present the geological record and the 2-version document, and she invited Holden to present the remediation design. Holden came to the front of the room and stood beside a printed reproduction of the hand drawing, now rendered in engineering-grade format, but retaining the essential logic of the plywood sketch. He did not begin with his credentials. He began with the borehole map, and he walked the panel through the data the way he had walked the engineering team through it in the site trailer, without theater, without jargon deployed as intimidation, without any attempt to make the room feel it needed him specifically rather than the information he was carrying. A city council member asked why the panel should accept a design from someone without an active architectural license over the work of a credentialed firm. Holden looked at him and said, "Don't trust me because of who I am. Trust the crack. Trust the old map. Trust the water that has been running under this site for 150 years, because I am just the person who was willing to look at it." The room was quiet after that, in the way rooms go quiet when something true has been said. In plain language, Brielle's data held under questioning from the city engineers. Delaney's corporate filing documents connecting Vaughn to the acquisition consortium were entered into the panel record, causing a procedural disruption that Vaughn's attorney attempted to contain but could not fully manage. Quinn spoke last among the investors and said that he had put capital into this project on the basis of its future, not its paperwork, and that what he had seen from the revised plan was a future worth continuing to invest in. The city did not approve the revised plan in the room that day, but they issued a conditional extension of the active permit, which meant construction did not stop, which meant Vaughn's window for a distressed sale acquisition had closed, which was the only outcome that mattered before the next board session. Vaughn was not finished after the permit session, and the people who worked for him moved quickly to the next instrument available. Garrett produced a document package arguing that Holden's Sky Harbor Living Foundation concept was not original work, but was substantially derived from a concept study developed years earlier, under the Holloway Urban Lab brand, registered under Garrett's former firm's intellectual property portfolio. The package was cross-referenced and professionally assembled, and it was designed to accomplish 2 things: cloud the legal status of the design Celeste had now publicly committed to, and suggest that Holden was not an underappreciated talent, but a man who had appropriated someone else's concept and dressed it up as innovation. Garrett timed the release carefully, knowing that a credibility attack on the design's author was the one weapon remaining to him after the permit session. Holden went still when Celeste showed him the package. She watched him carefully, because she had been wrong about him before and was no longer willing to substitute her assumptions for observation. He was not defensive, and he was not surprised, and the specific quality of his stillness was the kind that comes not from guilt, but from recognition, the expression of someone who has watched this particular move before. He asked her for a day before she responded, and the next morning he arrived with Lawson Drake. Lawson Drake was 73 years old and had spent 50 years as a practicing architect in Chicago, had taught at 2 universities, and had retained every original drawing, every dated file notation, and every supervision record from his entire career in a meticulous paper archive that his former students had mocked him for maintaining, and then called on in moments exactly like this one. Lawson had supervised Holden during his student years and had continued working with him informally after Holden left his program to care for his wife during her illness. He produced the original dated drawings in Holden's hand from a project concept Holden had developed while working as an unpaid intern at Holloway Urban Lab before his wife became ill before he left the field, before anyone had registered a version of the concept under a firm name. The drawings carried Holden's handwriting, his characteristic structural notation style, dates that preceded the Holloway Urban Lab registration by 14 months, and file metadata from a workstation account assigned to Holden during his internship. Betrayal found corroborating data in archived project files through a contact at the city, and the first digital file for the concept bore Holden's username, a creation timestamp from his intern period, and revision notes in a second hand that Lawson identified as belonging to a former partner of the Holloway firm. What Garrett had done years ago, and what Holden had never had the resources or standing to contest, was to register the work of a young man who had walked away from the industry to take care of the things that mattered more to him than recognition. Celeste listened to this and felt the weight of it in a way she could not separate from her own behavior on the construction site. The ease with which she had dismissed Holden not because she had evaluated his work, but because of the jacket he was wearing and the surface he was drawing on. Holden said he did not want the situation to become about personal restitution. He wanted the design to proceed, the construction workers protected from liability, and the record corrected. Celeste told him quietly that if he did not allow his name to be restored to the record, Garrett and Vaughn would continue using the gap as a weapon, and that a design without a protected author was a design anyone could take. Holden was quiet for a long moment, and then he said he understood and that he would stand behind the record because the work deserved it, even if he did not particularly want the attention. The board session that decided the fate of Sky Harbor was held on a Thursday morning at the Mercer development offices downtown, and everyone with a stake in the outcome had spent days preparing for it. Vaughn arrived with a motion to remove Celeste from operational control of the project, a resolution to enter the acquisition process with the unnamed development consortium, and a legal claim challenging the design's provenance. He had prepared for a defensive CEO and a room that had run out of confidence in her. He had not prepared for what actually walked through the door. Celeste entered the boardroom with Holden, Delaney, Betrayal, and Lawson Drake, and she opened by telling the board that she had made a serious error in judgment on the construction site several weeks earlier, that she had dismissed a valid safety concern because of who had raised it rather than what he had said, and that the decision to correct the record was hers, and she made it without reservation. She did not frame the acknowledgement as a political move. She made it the first sentence she said in the room, and the board felt the difference. Betrayal walked the board through the complete geological record, the two-version document and the structural model comparing outcomes under both foundation approaches, presenting it with the precision of someone who had been right about this from the beginning and had been waiting months for the room to be ready to hear it. Lawson Drake placed Holden's original drawings on the conference table and walked through the provenance in the methodical way of an educator who had explained complex things to skeptical audiences his entire career, drawing a clear line from Holden's internship period work to the concept now registered under Holloway Urban Lab's name, establishing that the design belonged to Holden Barrett by origin, documentation, and right. Delaney presented the corporate filings connecting Vaughn's family trust vehicle to the acquisition consortium, the digital trail of the document modification removing the canal corridor from the permit file, and the timeline of communications between Vaughn and Garrett that preceded each key decision point in the crisis. She presented it without editorializing, as a sequence of facts the board was now formally in possession of and legally obligated to consider. Sterling Quinn spoke before anyone called on him. He said he had come into this project as a financial partner, not a referee, but that the information presented in the room changed what he understood about the risk environment he had been operating in, and that his continued participation was conditioned on a governance structure with no role for either Von Mercer or Garrett Holloway in the Sky Harbor decision chain. He said he had reviewed the revised foundation design with his own engineering consultant the night before and had been told it was not only structurally sound, but possibly the most interesting approach to a riverfront development he had seen in 20 years. He said he was in. Holden was asked to speak before the vote. He stood at the end of the long table and said he was not there for credit, recognition, or his name above a door, and that he had spent 15 years being all right with that and would continue to be all right with it if that was what was needed. He said he had one interest in that room, which was that the project be built on what was true about the ground it stood on, not on what was convenient to record. The board voted to suspend Vaughn from all Sky Harbor decision-making pending governance review, to refer the document modification evidence to the company's independent audit committee, and to authorize Celeste to proceed with the revised foundation design under the project leadership structure she had proposed. The design, drawn on a sheet of plywood, was now the official plan for a billion-dollar development, and the name on the design documents was the name that had always belonged there. Celeste went back to the site on the following Monday morning, to the same stretch of temporary concrete where she had laughed at a man's pencil marks and decided in 30 seconds what kind of person he was. She called the crew together, not just the management team but the framers, the concrete workers, the equipment operators, the surveyors, the young engineers who had been watching the whole situation from a careful distance. And she stood in front of them without notes or a prepared statement. She said that she had been wrong on this site in a specific and consequential way, that she had looked at Holden Barrett and seen a worker's vest instead of a person worth listening to, and that her dismissal of his warning had contributed to weeks of delay, anxiety, and unnecessary risk for everyone who depended on this project. She said she was sorry without qualification and without the kind of framing that turns an apology into a press release. Holden accepted the apology in the same way he had accepted every other thing on this job site, without drama and without the kind of magnanimity that announces itself. He said he appreciated it, and that the apology that mattered most was the one she had just given to everyone present, not only to him, because there were people in that crew who had been watching the whole situation and learning from it what the rules of this industry were, and what they had just seen was a better lesson than anything delivered in a management seminar. Celeste offered him the role of lead design consultant for the remediation phase, which meant his name on the official design documents, a seat at every engineering coordination meeting, and final authority on any decision affecting the foundation and plaza concept he had developed. He accepted with one condition: that the project record reflect the contributions of Brielle Dawson, the field engineering team, and the construction crew who had flagged early concerns they were told to ignore, because he was not willing to participate in a version of events that converted a collective effort into a single heroic narrative. Piper came by the site late that afternoon, brought by the neighbor's oldest daughter who was doing Holden a favor, and she stood at the perimeter fence, looking at the model of the revised project displayed in the site trailer window. She was quiet for a moment and then asked her father if the building was going to have a pond in it. Holden told her it was going to have something like one. a reflection pool that remembered what used to run through the ground before anyone built on top of it. Piper said that was good, because things that forgot where they came from sometimes fell over. Holden looked at her for a moment and did not say anything, because there was nothing to add to that. Celeste stood at the edge of the work zone as the crew moved back to their positions, and she looked at the site the way she had not allowed herself to look at it before. Not as a demonstration of her capability or an argument she was winning against the people who doubted her, but as a place where a great many hands were doing the work of building something real on ground that had agreed to hold it. A year and 3 months after the permit hearing, the first phase of Mercer Sky Harbor opened to the public on a clear Friday morning in early spring, and the Canal Echo Plaza, that had once been the project's most dangerous liability, was its most celebrated feature. The reflecting pool ran north to south over the location of the buried waterway, flanked by elevated planting beds that bloomed with grasses and flowering shrubs selected for the wind patterns off the river, and a glass bridge walkway crossed the pool at the midpoint with the passive drainage cistern visible below, its waterlines marked by LED'd strips that read like a geological map when the light was right. The old warehouse at the western end had been fully restored, its original brick and timber frame intact, and it housed a community event space, a design library, and an exhibit about the history of the land, the buried waterway, the industrial neighborhood that had stood here before, and the people who had worked it. The tower above was unchanged in program but changed in character, its eastern face no longer a glass cliff dropping to a conventional plaza, but a building in conversation with the ground it grew from. Von Mercer was removed from the Mercer Development Board, pending the outcome of the Audit Committee's review of the modified geotechnical documents, and Garrett Holloway resigned from the advisory role before the audit concluded, citing personal reasons, which is the phrasing people reach for when the alternative is explaining themselves in writing. Sterling Quinn increased his investment in the project and introduced Celeste to 2 institutional partners. Interested in working with developers who had demonstrated they could navigate a crisis without a cover story, Celeste restructured the project management process across all Mercer development properties to include a site-level review board with rotating membership drawn from field engineers, construction specialists, and local technical experts, with a standing mandate to flag anything the official design team had reason not to see. She gave the program Holden's name without telling him in advance, and he found out from Piper, who had been told by a neighbor who read about it in a local business publication. Holden did not give interviews. He sent a short, written statement through Delaney's office, thanking the engineering team and the construction crew, and noting that the most important design decision in the project had been the one to stop fighting the ground and start learning from it. He still worked out of his small building shop on the north side, still took projects one at a time, still arrived early and stayed late, and his name was now on the design panel at Sky Harbor in the position it had always deserved, not as a footnote, but as the first line under the project title. At the opening ceremony, Celeste crossed the plaza and stood beside him at the far end of the glass walkway, where he was watching the water move in the cistern below with the same focused attention she had watched him give to borehole data, to wall cracks, to the behavior of soil that had been trying to say something for 150 years. She said, "You saved this project." Holden shook his head slightly and looked at the water running quietly below the glass and said, "I didn't save it. I just drew the part of it that was done pretending." Piper found her father later that evening, after the ceremony crowd had thinned, and set a drawing on the work table in the site trailer. A child's rendering of a tall building standing over a garden full of water. Clouds in the corners the way children draw clouds, the kind of structural confidence that does not know enough to doubt itself. In the lower corner, in careful second-grade handwriting, she had written, "Dad builds things that don't sink." Holden folded the drawing and put it in his vest pocket. Outside, Mercer Sky Harbor was lit against the Chicago skyline, its Canal Echo Plaza returning the last of the evening light back into the river. A billion-dollar project saved not by a boardroom decision, but by the pencil marks of a single dad builder who had been laughed at for daring to draw the truth on a sheet of plywood.